Hello, and welcome to The Filibuster, the podcast of the Union University Political Science Department. The filibuster refers to the right of unlimited debate in the world's greatest deliberative body, the U.S. Senate. Now, we are going to limit ourselves here, so maybe we don't quite live up to our name in that way, but I'm joined today by Sean Evans, the chair of the Political Science Department here at Union and professor of political science, and I am Seth Brake, visiting assistant professor of political science. So, of course, today we are here after the 2024 presidential election, and it's an election where we got a result. I don't know if you expected to get the result as quickly as we did. Did you, Sean?
No, and I think I saw the over-under at one point was on Saturday, and we knew 3 a.m. the next morning.
Yeah.
So this was a lot quicker than people expected, especially since everything expected it to be so close.
That's right. I know I was prepared for a long night, and I got to bed before 2.
Well, right. I mean, and you stayed up longer than I did on that.
Yeah, well, so we had our results, and it's Donald Trump coming back for another term. He's going to have a non-consecutive term. And
we can't really underestimate the significance of this. We have someone who was twice impeached, multiple time indicted, convicted felon, called a fascist, and he wins a majority of the vote, and he won all 7 swing states.
Yeah, that's really something.
I think this was something that surprised everybody, and I think that sends a message to the Democratic Party if they're willing to listen to it.
So you talk about this as a surprise. I know I was surprised, and I was flipping through the different predictions that we had our students and faculty make, and I think most people were surprised, maybe not by the outcome itself. I think Trump was the favorite in our prediction pool, but, well, I got it dead wrong. I had a Harris prediction, so maybe there's a reason I'm not the one getting asked questions of here.
Well, at least on this and for this year, we'll see. Yeah, I think when we look at this, I think why most people, or at least most of our students probably chose Trump because they're more Republican in nature. But I think if you look at it from a more objective point of view, it was clear that the fundamentals favored the Republicans this entire time.
So what do you mean by fundamentals?
Okay, so the things that most people care about, the things that are going to make a difference. The top issue everyone was concerned about was the economy and inflation, and they trusted Trump on that. Number 2 in most polls was immigration, and they trusted Trump on that. So if you look at the things that people were most concerned with, they trusted the other party with. You also look at the fact that President Biden had 41% approval. That's awfully hard for your party to win because I explain most elections by incumbent performance. If the incumbent party does well, they're rewarded. The incumbent party does not do well, they do poorly. You take into fact that 41% approved of Biden, 70% of the public thought the country was on the wrong track. Yeah, it's easy to predict the Republicans to win. The thing is, it was Trump. And so the idea was the distaste for Trump going to outweigh Republican fundamentals, and we found out it doesn't.
So I imagine a lot of Democrats right now are thinking to themselves, maybe if we had stuck with Biden, things would be different. But it sounds like you're saying that's not the case.
No, I think if they stuck with Biden, it would have been worse because you saw where Biden was behind in the polls by a significant margin. And then he had his problematic debate performance. It dropped more. I think Trump would have won in a larger landslide and could have possibly won some blue states if they had not made the switch. I know a lot of people are blaming Harris for this, but if you look at it, she outperformed the performance of the Democratic Party's approval by about 8 points. So that's pretty good on some.
So we can't blame Harris for this outcome
then. No, I mean she made it close. I mean, I would say I think she did make an error the last 2 weeks when she started focusing more on Trump instead of explaining why people should vote for her. Because Trump gives people a reason every day to remind them about why they don't like him. Her job was to try to convince people, here's a reason to vote for me. And I think by focusing on Trump's a fascist, a threat to democracy and everything, it maybe makes people fearful, which may help people get out and vote. But Trump's a get out the vote machine for both parties. He's going to get Democrats out to vote. It's how do you win those undecided? And I don't think having Lynn Cheney and others around is what did it for her. Well, clearly did not do it for her, because it was about Trump instead of about Harris.
Well, it almost sounds like it was a lost cause from the start, but that's hindsight, right? I mean, were there points that we thought that maybe this could have been changed or adjusted? And I know the counterfactual is unobservable.
Sure. Well, I would say that once you saw the switch from Biden to Harris, you did see the tightening of the polls, where Harris was in the lead for all except for like the last 2 weeks of the election,
which is when the election was, right?
Right. Well, I mean, and part of what I think was a key sign about the fundamentals was she had all this wonderful attention for like 6 weeks when Biden dropped out. She was kind of jumped into the role, had positive press coverage going through the convention and after that, and she still wasn't that far ahead. Right. And so that right there was a sign to where if she's getting all this positive attention and Trump is still right there neck and neck, that shows you the drag that the past 4 years have been.
Well, this whole conversation, we keep referencing the polls as our metric, right?
Yeah.
And we were watching the polls all the way through. You know, it was who's ahead wins the bump, what's the outcome. But how useful were polls in understanding this? I mean, is this an election? Sometimes after an election, we say, wow, the polls really got it wrong. Sometimes we say the polls were spot on. I mean, where do we fall on this time?
Well, I think, okay, there's two ways of looking at this. I think the polls were largely right as long as you understand there's a margin of error involved. Most of the polls showed it was neck and neck the entire time, plus or minus 3 and 4 points. And if you look at the final pollings, plus or minus 3 and 4, they fell within that.
Sure.
If we look at the swing state polls, they were fairly close too. With that, in that Trump was leading in North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and he won those. And he wasn't that far behind in Michigan and Wisconsin, and he won those too.
Right.
But remember, these polls still had each Harris and Trump within 1 point or less of each other in those states. So I think we did see some underperformance of Trump still in some of the polls. And I think a lot of this is because Trump was good at getting low propensity voters out, and those people are hard to contact and to get them to pick up the phone or take any kind of survey. So
maybe this is just the weakness of the mind when it comes to interacting with the polls and things like that. But if we say it's close, when we say it's a statistical tie, and then all of a sudden everything breaks in one direction, I mean, weren't we missing something? If it was really a tie, shouldn't some have gone one way, some have gone another? Or?
Yeah, well, but if you look at the trends last 2 weeks, that's where we saw Trump finally move from trailing to being ahead in the national vote. I mean, still marginal. I mean, 1% or less. So we did see it tracking on some level.
Well, what are the big lessons we can draw from this then?
Okay, well, I think there are some lessons we have that explains a few things for the past 4 years, and I think are also lessons that the incoming administration should keep in mind. I think the first one I would say is pay attention to the people and less attention to the base. I think that's one of the big problems that the Democratic Party had is they won. They had a narrow margin. They barely won the House, and they only won the Senate because Trump claimed the election was stolen, which depressed turnout in Georgia for them to flip the Senate, but it's still 50-50. And then Biden tried to push through $4.5 trillion in new spending. And regardless of the merit of that, I think the problem is they said, okay, we're not really concerned about what's going on. It's like, how can we make our party happy with the infrastructure bill and what they called the human infrastructure bill, which eventually became the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. And so the problem is they focused on this when the polls were showing the concerns that the American public had for the past 4 years were inflation and immigration. And they really did nothing about inflation. In fact, they said at one point, we don't have inflation. It's not a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And it was clear it was a problem. And while the Federal Reserve is mostly responsible for getting inflation under control, the Democratic spending plans primed the pump a little bit and contributed to that inflation. Polls for the past 4 years have said people have been concerned about immigration, meaning border security, and the Biden administration undid all of the Trump restrictions, and then they only tried to do something about it at the 11th hour when they saw it was a problem. Look at the polls. If the polls show something is important, you need to pay attention to that. Now, in this, I can say, okay, you can make the argument that climate change is important, dealing with racial inequality is important, and I would agree on some level, but that's only going to be successful if you also pay attention to what the public wants.
Right.
Because that's what happened. It was a incumbent performance election. People were upset at the incumbent, and it cost them. Second thing I would say is denial is not a strategy. The thing is, the Democratic Party and the Biden administration made arguments that everyone knew was not true. Inflation's not a problem. The border is closed. Biden is running rings around his staff. Everyone could look and see that what they're saying is wrong. The idea is we want to support our team by echoing what they say to get that message out to the public. But the simple fact is, when you're doing something that everyone knows is wrong or is not correct, you help your party by stepping up and speaking out to try to force change before the election so that you don't take the loss like they did. The third thing I'd say is don't misread your mandate. Biden barely won. He barely had a majority.
Mm-hmm.
He promised to heal the wounds, the soul of America, be more bipartisan, and he pursued a partisan course in many different ways. He attacked the Republicans. He demonized them at times. And so he didn't fit what he said he was going to do. And I think that's also a lesson to today for the Trump people.
Right, because they probably feel like they have a pretty big mandate right now.
Yeah, and the thing is, they don't. Okay, so look at this. He surprised people by winning all 7 swing states, and he surprised people by winning the popular vote. But let's look at this. We're still counting, but we're looking at the popular vote margin is going to be about 50-49. 50-49 is not a landslide.
Right.
The question is, did he have coattails? No. Okay, he picked up 4 seats in the Senate, but 3 came from red states, which you would expect to elect a Republican senator. If you look at the 5 swing state Senate seats, Republicans just won 1. 1 out of 5 is not coattails, and right now they have they're at 219 in the House, and there's a few races yet to be called, and I think they lead in 3, so that basically makes it 222 to maybe I'm doing some quick math here to 213. That's not a large margin to get things done. And so I think and they're thinking, oh, let's do tax cuts, let's deport everyone, let's do X, Y, and Z. And the simple fact is they're responding to the base, not to what the people are going to be concerned with. Because also, if you look at the exit polls, super majorities opposed deportation, banning abortion, ending not protecting the climate. And so the kinds of things he's wanted to do are things that people aren't necessarily in favor of. And remember, those large tax cuts will put more people in more money in people's pockets, which could potentially mean more cash chasing fewer goods, which contributes to inflation.
Right.
So the lesson is, what do the people consider to be important, and then do something about that. That's what democratic legitimacy is built upon.
Okay. And that's all, I mean, that's all well grounded there, especially the point is well taken that, the coattails didn't exist. But at the same time, here we have a Republican who just won the popular vote. And I mean, when was the last time that happened?
2004.
So this is 20 years.
Right.
20-year
He won it 50-49.
Yeah.
It was a split vote. I would suggest this was a TKO, not a knockout. And basically, I would say the Democrats lost more than Trump won.
Can we talk a little bit about the Electoral College outcome then? So it was close, but it was unique for Republicans, I think, right? I mean, what does it mean that this is the first time Republicans have done this in a while? You talk about this as as something that should speak more about the Democrats' low performance, and maybe so, right? But this is still a sort of unique moment for the GOP, isn't it?
Yeah. So before this time, they had lost 7 out of the last 8 popular votes, which is unheard of in history.
Yeah.
So now it's 7 of 9,
okay.
Which is still a problem for the GOP.
But maybe not for Donald Trump.
Well, he still has 4 years left, and he wants Republicans to control the Congress, and he wants J.D. Vance or someone else to replace him. So it is significant that he was able to win, in which case people thought that he could not. But it also talks about the scrambled nature of the parties themselves.
Yeah.
And remember, it's 50-49. It's in the previous election, it was 51-46. So he gained, Dems lost. But 50-49, it doesn't take that many more to switch to get the Democrats back in power.
Right. Well, at least back in the popular vote. But, I mean, you got to swing a lot of swing states, right?
Right. But I mean, remember, the margins in those 7 swing states was not very large at all. It wouldn't take a large number of votes for a Democrat to win those.
Now, you did say something in your last answer that got me thinking. You talked about the parties being scrambled. Is it right to say that there is change, dare I say even realignment going on in political parties right now?
Okay, well, I'm not too sure about the word realignment. I think we understand that there's a realignment 10 years after it's happened or so. But what we do see is there are shifts. The question is, are the shifts temporary or are they permanent? And so there are a couple things I'd say. One, I think the emerging Democratic majority thesis or demographics is destiny is out the window. The Democrats since Obama have said younger people, women, and minorities are becoming a larger part of the country. That will make the Democrats the permanent majority. Well, what we found out is something that I think is important, is just because you're a minority does not mean you're going to vote a certain way. We saw Trump has cut into minority vote, particularly among minority males, among blacks at smaller rates, but among Hispanics at larger rates. But what we also saw is that Trump won Native Americans. He cut into the advantage with Asian Americans. And so the question is why? Because we would say, oh, well, his racially tinted language would turn them off. But I think this gets to the economic condition. When we're looking at minorities, some are affluent, and if they're second and third generation, they're more assimilated into the country. They probably think of themselves less as a minority and more about kind of more American in that sense. They may be more affluent, makes them more Republican. But I think a big part of this was inflation. When you have unemployment, that really hurts the people who are unemployed, but affects less the people who are employed. Inflation affects everyone. It especially affects poor people because they have less money and they need to stretch it further, and inflation makes it more difficult for them to stretch it. And so I think there are quite a few people who said, I was actually better off when Trump was president, and they're hopeful for that. So if he can keep the good economic times rolling, then yes, this could be a permanent shift. But if not, we're going to see them revert back to Democratic voting.
So is that what he has to do? Strong economy and it's locked in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a key point. Now, I will say...
that's easy.
Yeah, easier said than done.
Yeah.
But I think what we have seen is that there has been a shift in the Republican Party. They used to be a more affluent suburban party than our working class party. And it's historically been the people shifting have been white working class. And this shift predates Trump.
Right.
But Trump has kind of appealed to that group in ways that others have not. And we also see that he's reached into minority working class, which is also important in a shift. And so the question is the Republican Party going to develop policies that reflect and help the working class? The problem is the elite level is still economic libertarian. You look at what Trump's talking about, tax cuts, okay, that's going into that economic libertarian idea. Where he departs from that is tariffs, industrial policy on some level, and some other things. And the question is whether the Republican Party is going to follow him along with that. And also, is that something that will work? Historically, as you well know, statist policies don't work out that well long term.
Right.
I think another key change is Republicans used to be more educated. What we see now is there tends to be an education advantage for the Democrats, but the education advantage is not college degree, it's graduate and professional degree. And these are the people who have that disproportionate influence in the cultural, economic, and social and governmental institutions, and they're more anti-Trump. They are the ones who are less concerned about survival, and so cultural issues, quality of life issue matters to them more, and they push the social liberalism, which made a lot of people say, whoa, that's going too far. That is about that extreme. That's going with the base, not listening to the people on that level. The other big change, and the one I really haven't heard people talk as much about, is that the Republican Party has shifted from a social conservative party to a cultural conservative party. I looked in 2008, people who attended church once a week or more made up 47% of the Republican Party, compared to those who seldom or never were 26. By 2020, once a week or more was 35%, but those who attend seldom or never, 41%.
Interesting.
And so that's why you could see Trump basically say, I'll be the greatest president for reproductive rights, drop a ban on abortion, change the language to where same-sex marriage was not mentioned, to where the issues he focused more on the platform and in other things are the cultural issues. Immigrationism, wokeism, racial issues, crime, and those kinds of things. And I think this sends a message to a lot of Republican politicians, is the idea, hey, if I want to win, social conservatism isn't a winning issue, but cultural conservatism is. And I think that's a problem long term, because I'll be upfront, I'm pro-life, and I realize that the ban on abortions is politically untenable at this time, but I want to move in that direction. This victory is a push in the opposite direction of that. The other thing I say is, I think part of losing that social conservatism is the importance of faith, the idea of virtue and self-control, which is important in individual success in terms of making good decisions so people can flourish. But it's also a problem in the sense of civil discussions. There's more humility, and the idea of civility that comes from religion, which in the cultural conservatism, you lose that. And I think that's part of the things that we have lost and is making our polarization worse is we have fewer people with those faith commitments, which may restrain them in ways,
Sure.
though I will say there are people of faith who have gone off the deep end at times. But I do think in general, religion does promote an ethic of restraint.
So there's two things I want to follow up on that, and then we might be running out of time after that. But the first thing I want to ask is just on the level of the terminology. On the level of terminology, the difference between social and cultural conservative is something I want you to just very briefly explain, because I'll be honest, I use these terms almost interchangeably when I talk about these things. So how would you define the difference between social and cultural conservative?
Okay, so the way I'd make the distinction is conservatism is concerned with the glue problem. How do we keep a diverse society together?
Yeah.
And the social conservative answer says religion is the answer. It gives us a common morality, which also, by the way, helps us put restraints on government by saying some things that you do are wrong. But it's also a place for people to gather. It's a place for community building, for creating social capital in political science terms. Cultural conservatism is about tradition, is the way that we keep people together. And so we do things because that's the way it's always been done. So
Right.
so the idea on sex and gender, it's not that that some things are sin, it's just that, well, that's not the way it's been done in the past. It's the idea, we're concerned about saying Merry Christmas instead of Happy Holidays. It's the idea about immigration. Is that changing the kind of country we are culturally, demographically, and in other kinds of ways? And so it's just a focus about what keeps us together. And I would say cultural conservatives tend to also be less religious in general.
Well, that's fascinating, and I think it's a useful distinction. There's so much more I want to ask you about this. I want to talk about some of these rumored appointments that we've seen now and some of the things he's announced. I want to talk about what this means for future policy, what predictions we might think this means for the administration, but we are about out of time for today, so maybe we'll talk about those things next time. But for now, I'm just going to yield back the remainder of the balance of my time.